Rain hammered against the tall windows of Draymore Hall the night Elaine Whitmore learned she would be married before the sun rose. She was not told gently. Her father, Lord Edmund Whitmore, burst into her small room, with a candle shaking in his hand, and said only one sentence that changed everything. "Corinne is gone. You will wear her dress." Elaine sat up in bed, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Gone? Her half-sister Corinne, the beautiful one, the favored one, the one the entire household had been preparing for weeks to send off to the Duke of Ashenmore, had vanished into the storm outside, leaving behind a wedding that could not be undone without shaming the family forever. "There is no time to argue," her father said, his voice tight with panic rather than sorrow. "The carriage from the Duke's estate arrives at first light. If a Whitmore bride does not step out of it, we are ruined, all of us. You will go in her place, and you will keep your face covered until the vows are spoken. He does not know what she looks like. He has never met either of you. This can still work." Elaine wanted to refuse. Every part of her wanted to shout that she was not a replacement, not a spare piece to be slotted into her sister's abandoned life. But she looked at her father's desperate eyes, and she thought of the debts whispered about in the servants' quarters, the unpaid accounts, the way the family name had been slipping for years. She thought of what would happen to everyone in this house if the wedding collapsed. And so, with her hands trembling and her mind spinning, she nodded. By the time the carriage arrived, Elaine had been laced into a gown meant for another woman's body, a veil pinned so thickly over her face that she could barely see the road ahead. She was given no time to think, no time to feel anything except the cold weight of what she was about to do. The carriage rattled through the dark countryside toward a man she had never seen, a man known across the kingdom only by rumor. They called him the Iron Duke. They said he had returned from years of war, with a heart as hard as the metals on his chest. They said he did not smile. They said he did not forgive. None of that mattered now. Elaine was going to marry him anyway. The chapel at Ashenmore was small and dimly lit, chosen deliberately for its lack of grandeur. This was not meant to be a celebration. It was meant to be a transaction, sealed quickly and quietly, away from the prying eyes of the court that had already spent weeks gossiping about the match. Elaine walked down the narrow aisle with her father at her side, her veil so heavy it pressed against her cheeks like a mask. She could see shapes through the fabric, blurred candlelight, blurred stone pillars, and at the end of the aisle, a tall figure standing utterly still. Duke Aldrich Thorne did not turn his head as she approached. He stood with his shoulders squared, his hands clasped behind his back, staring straight ahead, as though the woman walking toward him was simply another duty to complete before nightfall. Elaine studied what she could see of him through the veil. He was taller than she expected, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair cut short and a jaw that looked as though it rarely relaxed. There was a thin scar along his temple, pale against his skin, the kind of mark that told a story he had never bothered explaining to anyone. The priest began to speak, his voice echoing faintly against the stone walls. Elaine barely heard the words. She was too busy trying to keep her breathing steady, too busy praying that her voice would not shake when it came time to answer. Beside her, the Duke answered his vows in a low, clipped tone, the words spoken like orders rather than promises. When it was her turn, Elaine forced herself to speak clearly, and though her voice trembled at the edges, she did not falter. It was only when the priest instructed them to exchange rings that the Duke finally turned to look at her, or rather, at the veil that hid her. He took her hand without ceremony, sliding a cold band of gold onto her finger, and Elaine felt the brief, impersonal touch of his fingers against hers. He did not linger. He did not squeeze her hand or offer any small comfort. He simply completed the motion and stepped back, as though touching her for even a moment longer than necessary would be an inconvenience. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, there was no cheer, no applause, no warmth in the room at all. A few witnesses from the household staff stood near the back, silent and watchful. Elaine's father shifted uncomfortably by the door, clearly eager to leave before anyone asked too many questions. The Duke was instructed to lift the veil, as tradition demanded, so that the marriage could be properly witnessed. For one terrifying second, Elaine thought her secret would be discovered right there in the chapel, but the Duke did not lift the veil himself. Instead, he gave a short nod to the priest, who murmured that the formal unveiling could wait until they reached the estate, given the lateness of the hour and the exhaustion clearly written across the bride's shoulders. The Duke did not argue. In truth, he did not seem to care one way or another. He turned from her almost immediately, speaking in low tones to the man beside him, a tall officer with steady eyes named Julian Hale, who had served beside the Duke for years and now acted as his closest aide. Elaine caught fragments of their conversation as she was led toward the waiting carriage. The Duke's voice was flat and businesslike, discussing supply routes for the eastern fields, as though he had not just been married moments before. It stung more than Elaine expected. She told herself she should not care, that this marriage was never meant to be built on affection, only on necessity. But some small, foolish part of her had hoped for at least a flicker of curiosity from the man she now called her husband. There was none. Not that night, and not for many nights after. The carriage ride to the main estate was long and silent. Elaine sat across from her new husband, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the passing darkness through the small window. The Duke did not speak to her once. He stared out his own window with the same unreadable expression he had worn throughout the ceremony, his jaw set, his eyes distant, as though his mind was somewhere far away from the carriage, far away from her. When they finally arrived at Ashenmore Estate, Elaine understood immediately why people spoke of it with a mixture of awe and unease. The manor rose out of the darkness like something carved from stone and shadow, its towers stretching high above the surrounding grounds, its windows dark except for a few flickering lights near the entrance. It was beautiful in a cold, imposing way, much like the man who owned it. A woman with graying hair and a stern but not unkind face stepped forward to greet them at the door. This was Mrs. Bellamy, the housekeeper, who had run the household for over a decade and had seen the Duke through his darkest years. She offered Elaine a polite curtsy and a look that seemed to hold more questions than words could express, but she said nothing beyond the expected greetings. The Duke gave brief instructions for his new wife to be shown to her chambers, then turned and walked away without another glance in her direction. Elaine stood in the entrance hall, still wrapped in her veil, feeling smaller and more invisible than she had felt even in her own father's house. She had expected coldness. She had not expected to feel quite this forgotten on the very night of her wedding. Nora, a young maid with a kind face and quick hands, was assigned to help Elaine settle into her new chambers. As she carefully removed the pins holding the veil in place, she chattered softly about the household, about the routines of the estate, about how the Duke rarely spent time indoors and preferred long hours on horseback across his lands. Elaine listened quietly, grateful for the noise that filled the silence pressing in around her. When the veil finally slipped free and Elaine caught her reflection in the small mirror across the room, she almost did not recognize herself. Her face looked pale and tired, her eyes red-rimmed from holding back tears she refused to let fall. She reached up and touched her own cheek, wondering, not for the first time that night, what exactly she had agreed to become. She thought of her sister, wherever she had run to, free of this arrangement while Elaine remained bound by it. She thought of her father, likely already asleep in a guest room somewhere in this vast house, relieved that his family's reputation had been spared. And she thought of the Duke, a man she barely knew, a man who had married a stranger without once looking beneath her veil, who had walked away from her within moments of the ceremony, without a single word of kindness. Nora returned briefly with a tray of warm bread and tea, though Elaine had little appetite for either. The young maid lingered a moment longer than necessary, clearly wanting to say something comforting but unsure of what words might fit such a strange and difficult night. Finally, she simply squeezed Elaine's hand gently, before slipping out and leaving her alone with her thoughts once more. Elaine thought back to the years before this night, to the countless family dinners where Corinne had been seated closest to their father, praised for her charm and her beauty, while Elaine sat quietly at the far end of the table, rarely addressed unless a task needed completing. She had grown accustomed to being useful rather than cherished, capable rather than adored. She had told herself for years that such a role suited her well enough, that she required no grand affection to feel her life had value. Yet standing now in the wreckage of a wedding built entirely on someone else's absence, she felt the old ache of being overlooked settle deeper into her chest than it ever had before. She rose from the bed and walked to the window, watching the last of the storm drain away into a soft, steady rain. Somewhere beyond the dark tree line, her father was likely already dreaming of debts quietly forgiven and a family name safely preserved, untroubled by what the cost of that safety might mean for the daughter he had so hastily dressed in another woman's gown. Elaine pressed her palm against the cold glass and allowed herself, just this once, in the privacy of an unfamiliar room, to grieve quietly for the life she might have had, before folding that grief carefully away and preparing herself to face whatever came next. Elaine lay awake long into the night in her unfamiliar chambers, listening to the wind pressing against the windows, wondering how she would survive a lifetime married to a man who had not even bothered to learn her name properly, let alone her face. She told herself this was simply how noble marriages worked. She told herself she would grow used to the silence, the distance, the emptiness of it all. But somewhere deep inside her, a small and stubborn part of her refused to believe that this cold beginning was the whole of her story. She did not yet know that the Duke had noticed something strange the moment her hand touched his during the exchange of rings. A faint, fleeting familiarity he could not place, gone before he could examine it. She did not yet know that somewhere in the depths of his guarded mind, a memory long buried was already beginning to stir, waiting only for the right moment to surface. For now, she only knew the silence of an unfamiliar bed, the weight of a marriage built on desperation rather than love, and the quiet, aching question of what kind of life waited for her behind the walls of Ashenmore Estate. She closed her eyes at last as the storm outside slowly softened into a gentle rain, unaware that her carefully hidden face, and the secret history it carried, would soon change everything for the man who now called her his wife. A scream tore through the east wing of Ashenmore Estate 3 weeks after the wedding, and Elaine was the one who caused it. She had knocked over a stack of old ledgers while dusting a forgotten shelf in the estate library, and one heavy volume struck her wrist hard enough to leave her gasping. Nora came running, along with a stable hand passing in the hallway, and within moments the Duke himself appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion, his expression sharp with alarm rather than his usual indifference. It was the first time Elaine had seen real feeling cross his face since the wedding night. "Are you injured?" he asked, his voice clipped but no longer entirely cold. Elaine, cradling her wrist, shook her head and assured him it was only a bruise. The Duke stepped closer anyway, closer than he had come to her in 3 long weeks of living under the same roof as virtual strangers. Candlelight from the wall sconces flickered across the room, and in the sudden movement of turning to check on her, Elaine's thin veil, the one she still wore out of habit and quiet self-protection, slipped from where it had been pinned and fell away from her face entirely. For a moment, neither of them moved. The Duke stared at her, his dark eyes fixed on her features with an intensity that made Elaine's breath catch in her throat. She braced herself for disappointment, for the same distant boredom he had shown her since their wedding day. Instead, something shifted in his expression, something she could not name. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed slightly, searching her face as though trying to solve a puzzle laid out before him. He took one step closer, then stopped himself, seeming to catch the strangeness of his own reaction. "Your face," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I have seen it before." Elaine's heart skipped. "That is not possible, Your Grace," she said carefully, pulling the fallen veil back over her shoulder rather than her face, unsure now whether hiding herself still mattered. "We have never met before our wedding day." The Duke did not answer immediately. He simply continued to study her, his brow furrowed, as though pulling at a memory buried under years of dust and distance. After a long moment he shook his head slightly, as if forcing the thought away, and excused himself from the room without another word, leaving Elaine standing alone among the scattered ledgers, her heart still racing from something she could not fully explain. That night, sleep did not come easily to the Duke either. He sat alone in his private study long after the household had gone quiet, staring into the fireplace, his mind drifting back to a place he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Years ago, during the brutal campaign along the northern border, he had been struck down in a skirmish that nearly ended his life. He remembered fragments only, the smell of smoke, the sound of distant shouting, and the face of a young woman who had knelt beside him in a crowded medical tent, pressing a cloth to his bleeding side while chaos raged around them. He had been half-conscious, slipping in and out of awareness, but he remembered her eyes clearly even now, calm and steady despite the horror surrounding her, her hands quick and sure as she worked to keep him alive. He remembered trying to ask her name before the darkness took him completely, and he remembered waking 2 days later in a different camp entirely, the young woman gone, no trace of who she was or where she had come from. He had searched for her afterward, quietly, discreetly, but the trail had gone cold within weeks. Eventually, the demands of war and command had forced him to set the memory aside, though it never fully left him. Now, sitting in his study with the fire crackling low, he could not shake the feeling that the woman from that tent and the woman he had unknowingly married bore an unsettling resemblance to one another. It was impossible, he told himself. Elaine was the daughter of a minor noble house, not a battlefield nurse who had vanished into the chaos of war. And yet the eyes, the steady calm beneath the surprise, the shape of her face in candlelight, all of it tugged at something deep in his memory that refused to let go. Over the following days, the Duke's behavior toward Elaine began to shift in ways that confused the entire household. He began seeking her out at meals instead of eating alone in his study as he had done since her arrival. He asked her small, careful questions about her past, her family, her years before the wedding, questions he had never bothered to ask before. Elaine, still wary of his sudden attention, answered honestly but cautiously, unsure what had caused this change and unwilling to let herself hope it meant something more than curiosity. He rose from his chair and crossed to a locked drawer in his desk, retrieving a small, worn cloth that had once bound the wound at his side. He had kept it for years without fully understanding why, unwilling to discard the only physical trace of that night, though he had never shown it to another living soul. He turned it over slowly in his hands now, studying the faded bloodstains as though they might somehow reveal the name he had never learned. Julian Hale found him there near midnight, still awake, still turning the old cloth between his fingers. His friend said nothing at first, simply pouring 2 glasses of brandy and setting one down within the Duke's reach. "You are thinking of the healer again," Julian said eventually. Not a question but a quiet observation born of years spent beside the Duke on countless battlefields. "I am thinking that I may have married her without knowing it," the Duke admitted, his voice low and uncertain in a way Julian had rarely heard from him. Julian raised an eyebrow, clearly startled, though he did not dismiss the possibility outright. "Stranger things have happened in this world," he said carefully. "If it troubles you this deeply, perhaps it is worth learning the truth properly, rather than allowing the question to sit unanswered between you and your own wife." Mrs. Bellamy noticed the shift immediately and mentioned it quietly to Nora one evening while folding linens in the servants' hall. "In all my years serving this family," she said, "I have never seen the Duke look at anyone the way he looks at her now, not even before the war took the softness out of him." Nora, who had grown fond of Elaine despite the strangeness surrounding her arrival, simply hoped that whatever was happening between the Duke and his new wife might grow into something real, something that could ease the quiet sadness she often saw in Elaine's eyes when she thought no one was watching. The Duke, for his part, could not explain his own behavior even to himself. He found himself watching Elaine across the dinner table, studying the way she tilted her head when she listened, the way her hands moved when she spoke, searching for confirmation of a memory he could not fully trust. He told himself repeatedly that it was foolish, that the woman from the war tent could be anywhere, could have any name, could bear no relation whatsoever to his wife. And yet the pull of the resemblance grew stronger with each passing day, refusing to be reasoned away. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after the incident in the library, the Duke invited Elaine to walk with him through the estate gardens, a request that startled her almost as much as it pleased her. The gardens stretched wide behind the manor, filled with late autumn roses clinging to their last blooms before winter set in fully. They walked in silence for several minutes before the Duke finally spoke. "I fought in the Northern Campaign several years ago," he said, his eyes fixed straight ahead rather than on her. "I was wounded badly enough that I nearly did not survive it. There was a woman who helped save my life that night, in a medical tent far from anywhere safe. I never learned her name. I have thought of her often since then, more often than I care to admit." Elaine's steps slowed slightly, her mind spinning backward through her own memories, though she said nothing yet, uncertain of where this conversation was leading, or why her chest suddenly felt tight with a strange, uneasy recognition. "Why do you tell me this, Your Grace?" she asked carefully. The Duke finally turned to look at her directly, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch again, just as it had in the library. "Because when I look at you," he admitted quietly, "I see her." The words hung heavy in the cool autumn air between them. Elaine felt her pulse quicken, memories she had long buried beginning to stir uncomfortably at the edges of her mind, fragments of a chaotic night years ago that she had never allowed herself to examine too closely. She opened her mouth to respond, unsure of what she even wanted to say, but before she could speak, a servant appeared at the garden entrance, calling urgently for the Duke's attention regarding matters that could not wait. The moment broke, and the Duke excused himself reluctantly, leaving Elaine standing alone among the roses, her mind racing with questions she was not yet ready to answer, even to herself. Over the following weeks, the Duke's attentions toward Elaine only deepened. He began escorting her personally to inspect parts of the estate she had never seen, sharing small pieces of his past he had never spoken of to anyone else in the household. He was still not an openly warm man, still carried the weight and discipline of years spent commanding soldiers, but the ice that had surrounded him since Elaine's arrival was slowly, unmistakably beginning to thaw. Elaine found herself both drawn to and frightened by this change. Drawn to it, because for the first time since her hurried, humiliating wedding, she felt genuinely seen by the man she had married. Frightened by it, because she could not shake the growing suspicion that the memory pulling at the Duke's mind was not a coincidence at all, but a truth she had spent years trying to forget. She remembered, though she had never spoken of it to anyone, a night long before her wedding when her father had briefly allowed her to accompany a family friend serving as a camp physician near the northern border, believing the experience might humble his overlooked younger daughter. She remembered the chaos of that single terrible night, tending to a badly wounded officer whose face she had never clearly seen in the darkness and confusion, before being pulled away and sent home within days, the entire experience buried beneath years of silence and shame at having been present somewhere so dangerous without her father's full permission. She had never told anyone the full truth of that night, not even Corinne. And now, walking the quiet halls of Ashenmore Estate as the wife of a man convinced she resembled a stranger from his past, Elaine began to wonder, with a growing sense of dread and disbelief, whether the stranger he remembered and the woman she had once been were, impossibly, one and the same. She said nothing yet. She was not ready to unravel a truth that could change everything, not until she understood it fully herself. But as the Duke's gaze lingered on her more and more each day, warm now in a way it had never been before, Elaine understood that the quiet, distant marriage she had expected to endure in silence was quickly becoming something far more complicated, far more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart, and far closer to the truth than either of them yet realized. The invitation arrived on a cold morning wrapped in gold ribbon, and the moment Mrs. Bellamy placed it in the Duke's hands, the entire household seemed to hold its breath. Prince Edwin was hosting the grandest ball of the season at the royal palace, and every noble family with any standing in the kingdom had been summoned to attend. For the Duke, who had avoided court gatherings for years since returning from war, the invitation was more than a social obligation. It was a test, one he had not expected to face so soon into his unconventional marriage. "You do not have to attend if you would rather remain here," the Duke told Elaine that evening, watching her carefully across the dinner table. "The court can be cruel to those it does not fully understand, and there will be questions about our wedding that neither of us has properly answered yet." Elaine considered his words for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her glass. She had spent weeks growing accustomed to the quiet safety of Ashenmore, sheltered from the judgment of society that had once dismissed her as the forgettable daughter overshadowed by her sister's beauty. The idea of stepping into a ballroom full of nobles who would scrutinize her every movement filled her with quiet dread, and yet, something stubborn inside her refused to hide any longer. "I am your wife, your grace," she said finally, meeting his gaze steadily. "Hiding from the court will only feed more rumors than facing it honestly. I would rather stand beside you and let them see me clearly than spend the rest of my life as a shadow they whisper about." Something flickered across the Duke's face, an expression that looked remarkably like pride, though he did not name it aloud. He simply nodded once and told her preparations would begin immediately. The following days passed in a blur of fittings and lessons. Elaine was fitted for a gown unlike anything she had ever worn, deep emerald silk that caught the light in a way that made her feel, for the first time in her life, genuinely beautiful rather than simply presentable. Nora fussed over her hair for hours, weaving small pearls through dark waves, while Mrs. Bellamy supervised every detail with the fierce protectiveness of a woman who had grown genuinely fond of the young Duchess in the short months since her arrival. On the night of the ball, Elaine stood before the tall mirror in her chambers, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. Gone was the frightened girl who had walked down the chapel aisle in a borrowed veil 3 months earlier. In her place stood someone poised, someone who carried herself with a quiet confidence she had not known she possessed. The Duke waited for her at the bottom of the grand staircase, dressed in formal midnight blue, his expression unreadable as always, though his eyes softened noticeably the moment she appeared. He offered his arm without a word, and together they stepped into the waiting carriage that would carry them into the heart of the kingdom's most unforgiving social battlefield. The royal palace glowed with hundreds of candles when they arrived, music spilling out through open doors into the cool night air. Elaine's heart pounded as they approached the entrance, painfully aware of the whispers already rippling through the crowd at the sight of the reclusive Duke finally appearing in public with his mysterious, rarely seen wife. Lady Vivian Ashcombe, a sharp-eyed courtier known throughout the kingdom for her endless appetite for gossip, was among the first to notice their arrival. She leaned toward her companions with a knowing smile, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "There she is at last, the forgotten Whitmore sister, hidden away like some sort of scandal the family wishes to bury. I wonder what could possibly be wrong with her that the Duke has kept her locked away in the countryside for so long." Elaine heard the comment clearly, and though her chest tightened with old, familiar humiliation, she forced her expression to remain calm, refusing to let the cruelty show on her face. Beside her, the Duke's jaw tightened as well, though he said nothing yet, simply guiding her further into the ballroom with quiet, steady confidence. Lord Peter Ashford, a young courtier known for his easy charm and even easier gossip, approached the couple early in the evening, offering a bow that was polite in form but curious in intent. "I confess, Your Grace," he said to the Duke, "half the court wondered whether you would ever appear among us again after returning from the border campaign, and now you arrive not only in society once more, but married as well. You must forgive our collective astonishment." The Duke offered only a measured nod in response, unwilling to feed the man's curiosity further, though Elaine, standing beside him, found herself unexpectedly amused by the courtier's transparent fishing for details. "Astonishment seems to be the theme of the evening, Lord Ashford," she said smoothly, a faint smile touching her lips. "I hope the court finds itself pleasantly surprised, rather than merely scandalized by the time the night concludes." Lord Ashford blinked, clearly not expecting such a composed reply from a woman he had assumed would be timid and easily flustered. He offered another bow, this one carrying a touch more genuine respect, before excusing himself to report the exchange to whichever circle of gossiping nobles awaited his return. The evening unfolded exactly as Elaine had feared it might. Nobles studied her from behind painted fans, whispering behind gloved hands, their curiosity thinly disguised as polite interest. Questions came at her from every direction, sharp and probing, thinly veiled attempts to uncover why the Duke had married so quietly, so suddenly, and to a woman society had barely acknowledged existed before her wedding. Elaine answered each question with careful grace, drawing on reserves of composure she had not known she possessed. She spoke of her admiration for her husband's dedication to his lands, of the quiet beauty of Ashenmore Estate, of anything that redirected the conversation away from the scandal everyone clearly hoped to uncover. Slowly, the sharpest edges of the crowd's curiosity began to soften, replaced by something closer to grudging respect, though the whispers never fully stopped. It was during a quiet moment near the edge of the ballroom, while the Duke had stepped away briefly to speak with an old military acquaintance, that Elaine's veil, worn that evening as a delicate, decorative addition to her gown rather than true concealment, was accidentally caught by the sleeve of a passing guest and pulled completely free from where it had been pinned. For a moment, panic flashed through Elaine as the thin fabric fluttered to the floor, leaving her face fully exposed beneath the blazing chandelier light for the first time in front of the entire assembled court. The room did not erupt into chaos. It did something far more unsettling. It fell utterly silent. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Dancers slowed their steps. Every eye in the vast ballroom seemed to turn toward the Duchess standing exposed and startled near the edge of the dance floor, and a wave of hushed murmurs spread rapidly through the crowd, far different in tone from the earlier gossip. "She looks exactly like her," someone whispered near the refreshment table, though Elaine could not immediately identify the speaker. An elderly woman standing near the wall, a former battlefield healer who had once served alongside the Royal Medical Corps during the Northern Campaign years ago, pressed a trembling hand to her chest, staring at Elaine as though seeing a ghost. "That face," the old woman murmured to those near her. "I would know it anywhere. She was the girl from the medical tents, the one who saved countless soldiers during that terrible winter, the one who vanished so suddenly no one ever learned what became of her." Word spread through the ballroom like wildfire, guest to guest, whispered story building upon whispered story, until the entire court seemed to be piecing together a mystery that had apparently haunted certain corners of noble society for years. Elaine stood frozen at the center of it all, her heart hammering wildly, unsure whether to retrieve her fallen veil, or simply stand still, and let the truth, whatever it truly was, finally surface. The Duke returned to her side just as the murmurs reached their peak, immediately sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. He looked at his exposed, startled wife, then followed the direction of dozens of staring eyes, and understanding dawned across his face with startling clarity. He had seen this reaction before, this particular mixture of recognition and disbelief, though he had never expected to witness it directed at Elaine in the middle of a royal ballroom. "Is it true?" he asked her quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear him over the swelling noise of the crowd. "Were you truly there, at the northern camps, all those years ago?" Elaine's throat tightened painfully. She had spent weeks avoiding this exact question, uncertain of the truth herself, terrified of what it might mean for both of them if her fractured memories proved accurate. "I do not know for certain, Your Grace," she admitted honestly, her voice trembling slightly. "I have fragments of memory from that time, pieces that do not fully connect, but nothing I could ever be sure of until now." Before the Duke could respond further, Prince Edwin himself approached, drawn by the commotion rippling through his own ballroom. He was a tall man with sharp, curious eyes, known throughout the kingdom for his fondness for intrigue and his genuine care for the soldiers who had served beneath the crown during the long northern conflict. "Duke Thorne," the prince said, his voice carrying easily across the now hushed room. "Is this truly the young woman who vanished from the medical camps all those years ago? Several of my own officers have spoken of her for years, always wondering what became of the healer who saved so many lives during that dreadful winter, before disappearing without explanation." The Duke looked at Elaine, searching her face for any sign of certainty, though he found only the same overwhelmed confusion he himself was struggling to process. Still, something in his expression hardened with quiet determination, a protectiveness that had not existed toward her even hours earlier. "Whatever the truth of her past, Your Highness," the Duke said firmly, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom, "she stands here now as my wife, the Duchess of Ashenmore, and she will be treated with the respect that title demands, regardless of whatever mystery surrounds her history." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd at the unmistakable protectiveness in his tone, so different from the cold, distant reputation he had carried for years. Lady Vivian Ashcombe, watching from the edge of the room, found herself unable to summon another cruel remark, her earlier mockery suddenly feeling foolish in the face of the genuine devotion now radiating from the once unreachable Duke. The rest of the evening passed in a strange, dreamlike haze for Elaine. Nobles who had barely acknowledged her presence at the start of the night now approached with genuine curiosity and, in some cases, quiet admiration, eager to hear any fragment of her story she was willing to share. She answered carefully, honestly, though the full truth of that long-ago night remained locked somewhere deep in her memory, refusing to surface completely no matter how hard she reached for it. By the time the Duke escorted her back to their waiting carriage near midnight, Elaine felt utterly exhausted, both from the emotional weight of the evening and from the unsettling realization that her carefully hidden past was no longer entirely hidden at all. The Duke sat across from her in the darkened carriage, watching her with an intensity that had grown steadily throughout the night. "I need to understand the truth, Elaine," he said quietly, using her given name for the first time since their wedding, a small but significant shift that did not go unnoticed by either of them. "Not for the sake of the court or the rumors, but for myself. I have carried the memory of that night for years, wondering what became of the woman who saved my life. If it truly was you, I need to know." Elaine met his gaze steadily despite the exhaustion pulling at her, something resolute settling into her expression. "Then let us find the truth together, Your Grace," she said quietly, "because I believe I am finally ready to remember." The carriage rattled onward through the dark countryside, carrying them both back toward Ashenmore Estate, and toward a truth that had waited years to fully surface, one neither of them could avoid any longer. A carriage arrived unannounced at Ashenmore Estate only 3 days after the royal ball, and the moment Mrs. Bellamy saw who stepped out of it, her face went pale with dread. Corinne Whitmore had returned, dressed in fine traveling clothes that suggested wherever she had run to during those missing weeks had not left her wanting, and her expression carried none of the shame one might expect from a woman who had abandoned her own wedding. Elaine was in the estate library when Nora came rushing in, breathless with the news, and she felt her stomach drop immediately. She had spent the past several days trying desperately to recover the fractured memories of that long-ago night in the northern medical camps, sitting for hours with the Duke as they pieced together fragments of recollection, slowly reconstructing a truth that had remained buried for years beneath fear and confusion. The timing of her sister's sudden reappearance felt anything but coincidental. She found Corinne waiting in the estate's main sitting room, perched comfortably on a velvet chair as though she had never left, as though 3 months of silence and scandal had simply not happened at all. Corinne's eyes swept over Elaine with obvious surprise, taking in the fine gown, the confident posture, the unmistakable transformation that had occurred since the last time the sisters had seen one another. "Well," Corinne said finally, a thin smile curling at the corner of her mouth, "it seems the forgotten sister has done rather well for herself while I was away. Married to a duke, celebrated at the royal ball, whispered about across the entire kingdom. Who would have imagined it?" "Why have you come back?" Elaine asked directly, refusing to let old habits of deference toward her sister creep back into her voice. "You made your choice when you disappeared before the wedding. I do not owe you an explanation for what happened after." Corinne's smile faltered slightly, replaced by something colder, more calculating. "I have come back because our father's debts have grown far worse since I left," she said, "and because I discovered something rather interesting during my time away, something that concerns your precious marriage a great deal more than you might expect." Elaine's pulse quickened, though she forced herself to remain outwardly composed. "What are you talking about, Corinne?" Corinne rose from her chair slowly, circling the room with deliberate, unhurried steps, clearly savoring whatever advantage she believed she held. "I always wondered why our father was so desperate to keep certain family matters quiet," she said. "Do you remember the summer you spent with our physician family friend near the northern border, all those years ago, before you were sent home so suddenly? I remember Father forbidding anyone from speaking of it afterward, insisting the entire experience be buried and forgotten. I never understood why, until recently, when I learned exactly what happened to you during those camps, and exactly why our father was so eager to hide it. Elaine felt the blood drain from her face. She had never fully understood herself why her father had reacted with such severe, almost frantic secrecy after that summer, why she had been forbidden from ever speaking of the experience to anyone, even within the privacy of their own household. "Tell me what you know," Elaine said quietly, her voice tighter now. Corinne's smile sharpened. "You were not simply a visiting guest at those medical camps, sister. You disobeyed father's explicit instructions to remain in the safe quarters, and instead worked directly among the wounded soldiers for nearly 2 full days, without any proper chaperone, exposed to danger and scandal that could have ruined this family's reputation entirely, if it had ever become widely known. Father silenced everyone involved, paid the family friend generously to ensure their silence, and forbade you from ever speaking of it again, terrified that if the truth surfaced, no respectable family would ever consider you fit for marriage." Elaine's mind spun as pieces long buried finally began clicking into place. "That is why I remember so little clearly," she realized aloud, more to herself than to Corinne. "Father made certain I would forget, made certain no one would ever connect me to what happened during those 2 days. And now," Corinne continued, her voice taking on a dangerous edge, "it seems the very scandal father worked so hard to bury has become the foundation of your grand romance with the Duke. How deliciously ironic. I wonder how the court would react if they learned the full truth, not the romanticized version currently spreading through every ballroom in the kingdom, but the real story of a young woman who defied her father's authority, who risked her reputation and safety without permission, who was hidden away in shame for years afterward, rather than celebrated as some sort of secret heroine." Elaine's heart pounded with fear, though beneath the fear something else was stirring as well, a stubborn refusal to let her sister's twisted framing dictate the truth any longer. "What do you want, Corinne?" she asked directly. "You did not return simply to remind me of old family secrets. You want something." Corinne's expression shifted, calculation replacing cruelty. "I want father's debts settled," she said plainly. "I want the allowance that should have come to me as the eldest daughter, now that you have secured such a fortunate marriage. And I want assurance that whatever influence you now hold as Duchess will be used to restore my own standing in society. Standing I sacrificed by fleeing an arrangement that clearly should have belonged to you all along, given how perfectly it seems to have worked out." Elaine studied her sister carefully, understanding now that Corinne's threats were rooted less in genuine malice and more in desperate self-interest, though the danger of exposure remained just as real, regardless of the motivation behind it. "I will not be threatened into buying your silence, Corinne," Elaine said finally, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion churning beneath the surface. "If you wish to spread this story to the court, then spread it. I have spent my entire life allowing fear and shame to keep me small and hidden. I will not continue living that way simply because you have decided to use old secrets as a weapon. You have changed," Corinne said quietly, studying her sister as though seeing her clearly for the first time in years. There was no mockery left in her voice now, only something closer to grudging surprise. "I remember a girl who would have agreed to anything, simply to avoid conflict, who would have handed over whatever I asked without a single word of protest. That girl spent years believing she deserved nothing better," Elaine replied evenly. "I am no longer willing to be defined by what I was too afraid to say. Whatever debts our father owes, whatever resentment you carry over how your own choices unfolded, I will not allow either to be settled at the cost of my silence." Corinne's confident expression faltered slightly, clearly not having anticipated such firm resistance from the sister she had always considered easily controlled. Before she could respond further, the sitting room door opened, and the Duke entered, having returned early from inspecting the eastern fields and drawn by the sound of raised voices echoing through the hallway. He took in the tense scene immediately, his sharp eyes moving between the two sisters before settling on Elaine with quiet concern. "Is everything well here?" he asked carefully. Corinne recovered her composure quickly, offering the Duke a polished smile entirely different from the coldness she had shown her sister moments earlier. "Your Grace," she said smoothly. "I was simply catching up with my dear sister after our long separation. Family matters, nothing that need concern you." The Duke's expression did not soften. He had spent enough years reading soldiers and enemies alike to recognize manipulation when he saw it clearly displayed before him. "Whatever family matters concern my wife," he said firmly, "concern me as well. I would suggest you speak plainly, Lady Corinne, rather than continuing whatever game you believe yourself to be playing within my household." Corinne's polished smile cracked slightly under the weight of the Duke's unwavering stare. Elaine, watching the exchange, felt a surge of something unfamiliar and steadying, the quiet strength of no longer facing her sister's manipulations entirely alone. "Perhaps," Elaine said, straightening her shoulders with newfound resolve. It is time the full truth was spoken plainly, to everyone, rather than allowed to remain a weapon in anyone's hands. I have spent enough years living in fear of a secret that never should have shamed me in the first place. She turned to the Duke, her voice steady despite the vulnerability trembling beneath her words. I believe I am finally ready to tell you everything I have remembered, Your Grace. Not in fragments, but in full. And I believe it is time the truth of that northern camp reached beyond these walls as well, told honestly, rather than twisted into scandal by anyone seeking to control it for their own gain. Corinne's face paled slightly at the shift in her sister's demeanor, clearly recognizing that whatever leverage she believed she held was rapidly slipping away. The Duke, meanwhile, watched Elaine with an expression of quiet, growing admiration, the last remaining walls around his guarded heart beginning to fully give way. Then tell me, he said gently, his voice softer now than Elaine had ever heard it. Tell me everything. And so, with her sister standing frozen nearby and her husband watching with steady, unwavering attention, Elaine finally began to speak the full truth of that long-buried night. Piece by piece, memory by memory, no longer afraid of what the telling might cost her, but ready instead to reclaim a story that had been hidden from her for far too long. Word of Elaine's confession spread through Ashenmore Estate within hours, though not through gossip or careless whispering, but because the Duke himself insisted the full truth be recorded properly and shared with the household staff who had shown his wife nothing but loyalty since her arrival. By the following morning, a summons arrived from the royal palace, requesting the Duke and Duchess appear before Prince Edwin and the assembled court to formally address the story that had captivated noble society since the ball 3 nights earlier. Elaine felt her nerves tighten as the carriage approached the palace once more, though this time, unlike her first anxious arrival at the royal ball, she did not feel the urge to hide behind a veil or shrink into the background. Beside her, the Duke reached over and took her hand firmly in his own, a gesture of quiet, unwavering support that steadied her more than words ever could have. Whatever happens in that room today, he said quietly, you do not stand alone. I will not allow anyone, noble or otherwise, to diminish what you did during that terrible winter, or to shame you for choices that only ever proved your courage. The grand hall of the palace was already filled with nobles when they arrived, word of the summons having spread quickly enough that no one wished to miss whatever revelations the morning might bring. Lady Vivian Ashcombe stood near the front of the assembled crowd, her expression a careful mixture of curiosity and lingering skepticism. Near the back, quietly watching, stood Corinne, who had been summoned as well given her role in threatening to expose the story before Elaine chose to reveal it herself. Prince Edwin sat upon a raised platform at the head of the hall, flanked by several of his most trusted advisors, including the elderly former battlefield healer who had first recognized Elaine during the ball. The prince gestured for the Duke and Duchess to approach, his expression carrying genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Duchess Thorne, he began formally, word has reached this court of remarkable claims regarding your presence at the northern medical camps during the final winter of the border conflict. Given the significance of those events to many families represented in this very hall, including several who lost or nearly lost sons and husbands during that campaign, I believe it only right that you be given the opportunity to share your account directly, rather than allow rumor and speculation to shape the truth in your absence. Elaine stepped forward, her heart pounding, though her voice remained steady as she began to speak. She told the assembled court of the summer she had spent as a young woman accompanying a family friend who served as a camp physician, of her father's strict instructions to remain safely within the designated quarters, and of the chaotic night when a sudden and overwhelming influx of wounded soldiers had left the medical staff desperately understaffed and struggling to keep pace with the crisis unfolding around them. I could not simply stand aside and do nothing while soldiers suffered mere steps away from me, Elaine explained, her voice growing steadier with each word. I had learned enough from watching the physicians during my time there to offer real help, even if it meant disobeying my father's instructions. So I did what I believed was right, and I worked alongside the medical staff for nearly 2 full days without rest, tending to wounded men as best I could, including, though I did not know it at the time, a badly injured officer who very nearly did not survive that night. She glanced toward the Duke, who stood beside her with quiet, unwavering pride evident in his expression. That officer, she continued, was Duke Aldrich Thorne, though I did not learn his identity until many months after our unexpected marriage, when fragments of memory I had long suppressed finally began resurfacing. A ripple of astonished murmurs moved through the hall, though this time, unlike the calculating whispers Elaine had endured during the ball, the reaction carried genuine warmth and admiration rather than scandal. The elderly healer standing near the prince's platform stepped forward, her aged eyes glistening with emotion. "I remember that night as clearly as if it happened yesterday," the healer said, addressing the court directly. "We were overwhelmed, badly understaffed, and losing men faster than we could treat them." A young woman appeared seemingly from nowhere and simply began working, calm and capable despite her youth, saving lives that surely would have been lost without her intervention. I searched for her afterward, wishing to properly thank her, but she had vanished before I could learn her name. I never imagined I would see her again, let alone standing here today as the Duchess of Ashenmore. The Duke stepped forward then, addressing the court directly for the first time that morning, his voice carrying the same steady authority he had once used to command soldiers in battle. "This woman, standing before you all, disobeyed her father's instructions not out of recklessness, but out of genuine compassion and courage that most in this room, myself included, can only hope to match. She saved my life that night, along with countless others, expecting nothing in return, not recognition, not reward, not even the simple dignity of having her name remembered. Instead of being celebrated for her bravery, she was hidden away for years, silenced and shamed by fear of scandal, forced to carry the weight of her own heroism, as though it were something shameful rather than extraordinary." He turned to look directly at Elaine, his expression softening into something unmistakably tender, a warmth the court had never before witnessed from the famously guarded Duke. "I did not marry Elaine Whitmore by careful arrangement or calculated choice," he continued. "Circumstances forced us together in the strangest possible way, and yet I have come to understand, more clearly with each passing day, that fate simply found its way back to where it always intended to lead. I do not stand here today as a duke fulfilling an obligation to a substitute bride. I stand here as a man who has found, after years of searching, the very woman who once saved his life, and who has since claimed his heart entirely as well." The hall fell into stunned silence at the raw sincerity of his words, so different from the cold, distant reputation he had carried for years. Elaine felt tears gathering in her eyes, though for the first time in longer than she could remember, they were tears of overwhelming relief and happiness rather than fear or shame. From the back of the hall, Corinne shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that whatever leverage she had once believed she held over her sister's carefully hidden past had utterly dissolved in the face of public celebration rather than scandal. Lady Vivian Ashcombe, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes, found herself, much to her own surprise, blinking back unexpected tears of her own. Prince Edwin rose from his seat, his expression solemn yet warm as he addressed the assembled court. "Let it be known throughout this kingdom," he declared, "that Duchess Elaine Thorne is to be recognized not merely as a noblewoman who married well, but as a woman of genuine courage and honor, whose actions during the Northern Campaign saved the lives of soldiers who might otherwise never have returned home to their families. Any lingering whispers of scandal surrounding her name are hereby formally and publicly put to rest." A wave of applause swept through the grand hall, genuine and unrestrained, as nobles who had once dismissed Elaine as the forgotten Whitmore sister, now looked upon her with open admiration and respect. The Duke reached for her hand once more, lifting it gently to his lips in a gesture of open affection he had never before shown in public, sealing with quiet tenderness the truth of everything he had just declared before the entire court. In the days that followed, the story of the Duke and his forgotten bride spread rapidly throughout the kingdom, transforming from whispered scandal into celebrated legend. Families who had lost loved ones during the Northern Campaign sought Elaine out personally to offer their gratitude, some through tearful letters, others through quiet visits to Ashenmore Estate itself, eager to finally thank the mysterious healer who had vanished so completely all those years ago. Corinne, stripped of any leverage she once believed she held, quietly returned to their father's estate, her earlier confidence considerably diminished, though Elaine, in a final act of quiet grace rather than lingering resentment, ensured a modest allowance was arranged to ease her sister's circumstances, choosing forgiveness over the bitterness that might once have felt entirely justified. Julian Hale, watching the Duke's transformation with quiet satisfaction, remarked one evening to Mrs. Bellamy that he had not seen his old friend laugh so freely since long before the war had ever called him away from home. Mrs. Bellamy simply smiled, replying that some wounds, it seemed, could only ever be healed by exactly the right hands finding their way back to them, however winding and unlikely the path that led there. Ashenmore Estate itself seemed to change in the weeks following the court's public acknowledgement, the once cold and guarded atmosphere gradually giving way to genuine warmth. Mrs. Bellamy often remarked to Nora that she had never seen the halls of the manor feel so alive, filled now with quiet laughter and the easy companionship between the Duke and Duchess that had been entirely absent during those first uncertain weeks of their marriage. Elaine, once dismissed and forgotten by nearly everyone around her, had become not only the celebrated Duchess of Ashenmore, but a symbol throughout the kingdom of quiet courage rewarded. Proof that even the most overlooked among them could hold within themselves the strength to change the course of an entire life, and perhaps, an entire kingdom's understanding of what true worth actually meant. And as the Duke stood beside her one evening in the very gardens where he had first confessed his suspicion of who she truly was, watching the last golden light of autumn settle softly across Ashenmoor's grounds, he found himself grateful, more deeply than he had ever expected to feel again after the darkness of war had hardened his heart, for the strange and unlikely circumstances that had brought this remarkable woman into his life, not as a forgotten substitute, but as the true and rightful center of it. A locked chest crashed to the floor of the estate archive room late one winter night, and the sharp sound sent Julian Hale sprinting down the corridor with his hand already on the hilt of his blade. He found the room empty except for scattered papers and a single window left open to the freezing night air, the intruder long gone before anyone could catch sight of them. When word reached the Duke the next morning, his expression darkened with a wariness that had not surfaced since the earliest days of his marriage. Someone had been searching through the estate's oldest records, specifically the documents outlining the line of succession for the Ashenmoor title, and only one name came immediately to the Duke's mind as a likely suspect. Gerald Thorne, his distant cousin, had long resented standing so far removed from a title he believed should have belonged to him, given that the Duke had returned from war with no children and, until recently, no wife at all. Gerald had made his ambitions known quietly over the years through carefully worded letters and occasional appearances at court, always testing the boundaries of propriety without ever crossing them outright. Elaine, informed of the break-in later that morning, felt an uneasy chill settle over her. "We should determine what exactly he was searching for," she said, standing beside the Duke as he examined the disturbed archive room himself. "If he believes there is some flaw in our marriage, or in your claim to the title, he may attempt to use it against us, now that our story has become so widely known throughout the kingdom." The Duke nodded grimly, already suspecting the same. Gerald has always believed that a Duke who returns from war too changed, too withdrawn, too unwilling to properly secure his line, forfeits some unspoken right to his own title, he explained. Our marriage, and the public affection now attached to it, likely threatens whatever quiet campaign he has been building for years to position himself as a more suitable heir should any opportunity arise. Within days, their suspicions proved accurate. Gerald arrived unannounced at Ashenmoor Estate, his manner polished and falsely warm, offering congratulations on the Duke's marriage while his sharp eyes studied every corner of the household with obvious calculation. He stayed only briefly, but his visit left both Elaine and the Duke certain that whatever scheme he was pursuing had not been abandoned, merely delayed. It was Nora, ever observant and quietly loyal, who first noticed something troubling. While assisting with the household linens one afternoon, she overheard two visiting servants from Gerald's estate speaking quietly in the hallway, mentioning a forged document meant to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the Duke's original wedding ceremony, given the unusual and rushed circumstances under which it had originally taken place. She reported the conversation immediately to Mrs. Bellamy, who wasted no time bringing the information directly to the Duke. "If Gerald intends to challenge the legitimacy of our marriage before the court," the Duke said grimly, gathering Elaine, Julian, and Mrs. Bellamy together that same evening, "he will attempt to use the very secrecy that once protected us as a weapon instead. The rushed ceremony, the substituted bride, the missing formal witnesses at the original chapel, all of it could be twisted to suggest impropriety, regardless of how thoroughly the truth was later revealed and celebrated at court." Elaine felt fear tighten in her chest, but beneath it, a new resolve had taken root since the day she stood before the entire court and reclaimed her own story, rather than allowing others to define it for her. "Then we do not wait for him to strike first," she said firmly. "We gather every proof of our marriage's legitimacy ourselves, the chapel records, the priest's testimony, the witnesses present that night, and we present it to the crown before Gerald has any opportunity to twist the truth into something ugly." The Duke looked at his wife with quiet admiration, no longer surprised by her courage, though it continued to move him deeply each time it revealed itself. Julian Hale, ever practical, offered to ride immediately for the small chapel where the original ceremony had taken place, to secure sworn statements from the priest and household witnesses who had been present that rushed, quiet night. Over the following week, the household moved with careful, determined purpose. Elaine personally visited her father, informing him plainly of Gerald's scheme, and requesting his full cooperation in confirming the legitimacy of the wedding, regardless of the awkward circumstances surrounding Corinne's original disappearance. Lord Edmund Whitmore, eager to protect his family's restored reputation, agreed without hesitation, providing a formal written account of the night's events. Meanwhile, the Duke called upon several of his former officers, men who had served beside him during the war and now held respected positions within the royal court, requesting their support in vouching for his character and the sincerity of his marriage, before any formal challenge could gain traction among the nobility. Gerald, sensing that his planned scheme was losing its element of surprise, grew increasingly desperate. He requested an audience with Prince Edwin directly, hoping to present his fabricated concerns about the marriage's legitimacy before the Duke and Duchess had the opportunity to properly defend themselves. However, word of his intentions reached Ashenmore Estate just in time, allowing the Duke and Elaine to arrive at the palace together, fully prepared, only hours before Gerald's scheduled audience. When Gerald stood before the prince, presenting his carefully constructed doubts about the rushed chapel ceremony and the unusual circumstances of the bride's substitution, he did not anticipate the Duke and Duchess entering the hall directly behind him, accompanied by the very priest who had performed their original wedding, along with signed statements from Lord Whitmore and several trusted witnesses confirming every detail of that quiet, hurried night. Prince Edwin listened patiently as each piece of evidence was presented, his expression growing increasingly stern as Gerald's fabricated claims crumbled beneath the weight of clear, honest testimony. "It seems," the prince said finally, addressing Gerald directly, "that your concerns regarding this marriage's legitimacy are entirely unfounded, and I find myself troubled by the timing and manner in which they were brought before this court, particularly given the forged document my own investigators discovered circulating among your household staff only days ago." Gerald's confident posture collapsed entirely under the weight of the prince's pointed accusation. He offered stammering excuses, insisting the forged document had been created without his knowledge, though few in the room believed the claim, least of all the prince himself. "Let this matter serve as a clear and final warning," Prince Edwin declared, his voice carrying easily across the hushed hall. "The marriage between Duke Aldrich Thorne and Duchess Elaine Thorne stands fully legitimate and fully celebrated by this crown. Any further attempts to challenge it through deceit or forgery will be treated as a direct offense against the throne itself, with consequences far more severe than damaged reputation alone." Gerald departed the palace that day thoroughly humiliated, his ambitions for the Ashenmore title effectively extinguished by his own desperate scheming. He did not trouble the Duke or Duchess again, choosing instead to retreat quietly from court life altogether, his name gradually fading from the whispered conversations that had once carried his ambitions so far. With the threat finally resolved, life at Ashenmore Estate settled into a peace neither Elaine nor the Duke had truly believed possible when their unconventional marriage first began, under such desperate, uncertain circumstances. The cold formality that had once defined their household gave way entirely to genuine warmth, laughter echoing through halls that had stood silent and guarded for years before Elaine's arrival. Months later, as spring returned fully to the grounds of Ashenmore, transforming the estate gardens into a vibrant display of blooming color, Elaine found herself once again walking those same familiar paths beside her husband, though everything about the moment felt entirely different from the uncertain conversation they had shared there so many months earlier. "Do you ever regret how it all began?" the Duke asked quietly, watching her carefully as they walked. "The rushed ceremony, the veil, the uncertainty of those first difficult weeks." Elaine considered the question honestly before answering, her hand comfortably intertwined with his own. "I do not regret any of it," she said finally. "Every difficult moment led us exactly where we were always meant to arrive. I was forgotten once, overlooked and dismissed by nearly everyone around me, including, for a time, myself. But you saw me, truly saw me, when it mattered most, and because of that, I finally learned to see myself clearly as well." The Duke stopped walking, turning to face her fully among the blooming roses, his expression carrying none of the guarded coldness that had once defined him so thoroughly. "I do not think fate brought us together by mere accident, that terrible, rushed wedding night," he said softly. "I believe some part of me recognized you long before I consciously understood why, and I believe I will spend the rest of my life deeply grateful that circumstances, however strange and difficult, ultimately led me back to the woman who saved my life not once, but twice over, first upon a battlefield, and later within my own guarded, unforgiving heart." Elaine smiled, tears of quiet happiness gathering in her eyes as the golden spring light settled softly around them both. Whatever challenges the future might still bring, whatever schemes or scandals society might yet attempt to stir against them, she knew now, with unshakable certainty, that she would face them all beside a man who had once been called cold and unreachable by the entire kingdom, but who had proven, in the end, to hold the most steadfast and devoted heart she had ever known. A full year after that quiet, rushed wedding in the small candlelit chapel, Ashenmore Estate welcomed guests once more, though this time for a celebration rather than a hurried necessity. Lord Whitmore attended proudly, along with a noticeably humbled Corinne, who had, in the months since her failed scheme, begun rebuilding a quieter, more honest life for herself, away from the schemes and comparisons that had once consumed her. The elderly healer from the northern camps arrived as well, insisting on seeing with her own eyes the joyful home the young woman she once searched for in vain had finally found. Mrs. Bellamy oversaw the preparations with the same fierce devotion she had shown since Elaine's earliest, uncertain days at the estate, while Nora, now trusted with far greater responsibility within the household, moved through the halls with quiet pride at how far her mistress had come. Julian Hale raised the first toast of the evening, praising not the Duke's title or his lands, but the steady courage of the woman who had somehow managed to soften a heart hardened by years of war. As the celebration wound down, and the last of the guests departed into the cool night air, Elaine and the Duke stood together once more in the estate gardens, watching the stars settle over the quiet grounds. So much had changed since that terrified, veiled walk down the chapel aisle, and yet the steady warmth between them now felt as though it had always been destined to grow exactly this way, patiently, honestly, and completely. And so, within the walls of Ashenmore Estate, the forgotten bride who had once entered a loveless, hurried marriage beneath a heavy veil, emerged fully and completely, as the celebrated duchess she was always meant to become, her quiet courage forever remembered, her story forever changed from one of obscurity into one the entire kingdom would continue speaking of for generations to come.